systems, people don't exist within these silos that we create in policy, right? People who experience mental illness or have mental health challenges also may be housing unstable, also may have not have access to food, also may not have access to transit, right? People are full humans and our policies are often these siloed branches of what exists within a person. And so that's just, I'm really happy that we're having these conversations kind of across some of these issues because they can become really siloed in policy, even though they're not siloed within communities and within individuals. So saying all of that, similar to what Sue was sharing, there's a lot happening in housing and a lot happening in housing kind of across the continuum, which I can share a little bit about what that means and how we're trying to engage across that. So services for people experiencing homelessness or people who are unsheltered, making sure that there's affordable rentals, safe and affordable rentals, and then access to home ownership and people staying in their home ownership. So we're trying to work across that all at the exact same time in kind of a few different ways. I'm going to talk through why they're important and not really get into the policy. And then I'm happy to talk more about the policy in detail. So the first piece that I think is really important is we actually don't have enough housing for especially Minnesotans with low income, not enough physical buildings. So we need to build more. It needs to be multifamily rental. It needs to be more shelters for folks who do want to go into shelter who are experiencing homelessness, which is obviously not everyone who's experiencing homelessness. And we also need more single family homes that are built with the intention for Minnesotans with low incomes for homeownership. We don't have enough housing stock. So we have to build more housing stock. And at the same time, we have very old housing stock across Minnesota that is dangerous, unsafe, that low income folks are basically forced to live in because it's the only option, right? So we need to preserve and rehab our housing stock. We need to make sure that people aren't living with lead in their houses. We need to make sure that people are living in houses that are somewhat weatherized so that as climate change continues, they can afford their energy bills and also be safe in their houses so it's not really cold or really hot in their homes, depending on the time. So we need to do both of those things. At the same time, we also need to make sure that we're increasing access to the housing that we have, right? So we need to work to, first of all, not displace people. Our state has really strict eviction law, meaning that people are getting displaced, and that's going to become a bigger issue probably in the next 3 months. We need to make sure people aren't getting displaced, that more people have access to vouchers and rental assistance long-term, and that they have somewhere to move into once they have their voucher. Because we already know that right now there are waitlists for vouchers and then waitlists to get into apartments across the state of Minnesota. But we need more vouchers, and then we also need more places that take Section 8 vouchers, that take housing choice vouchers. So we need to make sure people aren't being discriminated against because they have a voucher, that we have the stock that they can use their voucher in. And then we need to make sure that we have opportunities for home ownership, particularly for folks with low incomes, particularly for folks of color and Black Minnesotans in particular. We know that this state has incredible wealth gaps and wealth inequities, not just our state. We just happen to have one of the worst homeownership disparities in the country, right? So we're not unique, it's intentional. It was created intentionally through the GI Bill and the way that the GI Bill was intentionally exclusionary and discriminatory. It was created intentionally through redlining, but we are now at a place where wealth disparities between white Minnesotans and Black Minnesotans is growing. Now I'm not talking about income, I'm talking about wealth, right? That's what you pass on to your family. That's how you can pay for big payments like higher education. That's how you can potentially afford for health crises, which again, I don't think that you should have to be mortgaging your home to pay for a health crisis, but here we are. And access to safe homeownership, so homes that are not in disrepair that someone then buys and has to spend exorbitant amounts of money repairing. Homes that have really not predatory lending, right? That's a huge issue that faces people with low incomes in particular, and that often homes are still in many ways discriminating in the buying process, right? So people of color, particularly Black Minnesotans, are being discriminated against when they try to buy homes, whether that be because we often at our agency provide people with down payment assistance, right? So a grant, it's not a loan, just a grant to help people pay their down payment. And lots of realtors don't want to accept that grant as the down payment. But why should they care where the money comes from? It's money. It's the exact same. It's cash, right? Ownership, kind of getting into home ownership and then staying in home ownership, that our state has huge issues across the board on, and also we haven't really figured out how to rectify it. I think we have to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more innovative, because this is a huge problem and it's exacerbating every year. The issues and disparities grow every year. And so we have to come back from a hole anyways, and the hole is growing. So that's a very big, broad picture of the issues. And then we're trying to basically work across all of those issues to pinpoint policies that can at least start to mitigate the problems. We're in a huge housing crisis. This is not going to be solved in a year. I'm just going to be honest, it's going to take years and lots of intentional work. So I think there is a big push to change zoning law, both at the city across the state of Minnesota. Cities and towns across the state are thinking about this, and at the state level, I think honestly, the state is probably not going to do it. And my concern with some of the changes around zoning law is that it's changes around zoning law to build more market rate housing. And we need more market rate housing, but that does not help us get more housing for folks with low incomes, right? It is intentionally written often in ways that doesn't allow for actually more low income housing to be built, which I find to be really troubling in a lot of the changes around regulation. So I think that for me, zoning policy changes need to happen, but I think they need to be rooted in how to almost create or reparate redlining, like how can zoning policies be rewritten in ways that both build more low-income housing, but also think about the way that zoning has been exclusionary and been used as an exclusionary tool. And I worry that some of the language that I've seen is continuing that cycle in some ways, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, but that it's happening. And so I really want to push policymakers and specifically city and town council, like city council members, to think about the way that zoning is used. On the part about building and keeping projects and housing low income, there are specific programs that actually require developers to build housing that's for folks with low incomes. There's, depending on if it's a federal or state program, it might be under 50% of the area median income, it might be under 80% of the area median income, it might be, and that they have to maintain that affordability for often 15 years. The challenge is 15 years isn't that long. And then often what happens is 15 years comes and they immediately flip it to market rate or luxury, right? So you're creating these low income housing that's built intentionally to get tax credits that after 15 years are displacing everyone who lives there. And also then suddenly you have over market rate often apartments or condos or whatever it might be. And so I think part of it is also building into law that has to be a longer time. Like most people think 30 years. I am not even sure if that's long enough. I think it's a question of like, what could it look like for something to be built intentionally to forever stay low income? And I'm not sure what that could look like, but I think we should think a little bit more about that. Profit or Habitat, for instance, has a lot of financial counseling and also their own lending programs, and basically are their own real estate company. They wouldn't say it in those words, but they help people get into affordable housing for homeownership. I have not seen any examples of a bigger real estate company kind of intentionally doing this work. In fact, often they're intentionally not doing this work. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about how we could get them on board. They all, yeah, I think in some ways, the issues that I see in the metro are mirrored in greater Minnesota, but just in different ways, right? Like in greater Minnesota, often people are more likely to live in single family housing, whether it be rental or home ownership, varies across the state, but often it's like very old and not kept up and is filled with like lead and asbestos, right? So the issues are similar across the state in that there's not enough affordable housing. We've had our folks in Thief River Falls tell us that, in Wilmer, in Duluth, in St. Cloud, in Rochester, in Winona, in the Twin Cities, right? Like that is the true across the state, similar to how there isn't enough mental health care across the state. It is sometimes exacerbated. And I think something that is happening that's really interesting is Rochester is using their federal funds from the American Rescue Plan to build some kind of, to think about the way that they're structuring their city and to try to co-locate affordable housing in the downtown Rochester near transit, which is really vital because again, people live full lives. Folks use transit to get to their jobs, to get to their doctor, to get to childcare, to see family, whatever it might be. People use transit for a variety of things to have fun. And often we put affordable housing not anywhere near transit, right? That is a case in the metro and also in particularly some of the more rural cities where there isn't a lot of transit, that can be even more exacerbated. So I think they're doing some interesting things about thinking about how to build a structure of a city, which is hard to do once you have a city, but like how to make Rochester be a little bit more accessible for the people who live there by connecting transit to housing. So that's an example of something good. Since St. Paul and Minneapolis both have been thinking about building apartments over a specific amount of units that won't have parking anymore, which like theoretically, I love that idea. Great. We should, but these cities are not built for like actual transit. So what you're doing is you're just like excluding people, right? It's like good idea policy that actually becomes NIMBY in like these very interesting ways of who can then access the apartment, who can afford the Uber that they might have to take because it's not on the light rail, or they don't work on the light rail because the light rail goes in two straight lines, right? Like I think that there's like NIMBYism there too.